Welcome to episode 325 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Neelu Kaur about how to advocate for yourself when you're conflict avoidant. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode.
Hi, I'm Chris Gethard, and I'm very excited to tell you about Beautiful Anonymous, a podcast where I talk to random people on the phone. I tweet out a phone number, thousands of people try to call, I talk to one of them, they stay anonymous, I can't hang up, that's all the rules. I never know what's going to happen. We get serious ones. I've talked with meth dealers on their way to prison. I've talked to people who survived mass shootings. Crazy funny ones. I talked to a guy with a goose laugh, somebody who dresses up as a pirate on the weekends. I never know what's going to happen. It's a great show. Subscribe today, Beautiful Anonymous.
My guest today is someone whose expertise lies outside the education space, and also, unlike the vast majority of my guests, is not someone that I met online or through my work with other educators. Neelu Kaur is one of my yoga teachers at the local studio where I practice in New York. She only teaches one class a week there because Neelu also works as an organizational psychologist, self-advocacy champion, author, and keynote speaker. I noticed her book displayed in the lobby of the yoga studio one day, and the title caught my attention. It's called Be Your Own Cheerleader, an Asian and South Asian woman's cultural, psychological, and spiritual guide to self-promote at work. Thumbing through it, I could see that Neelu's message was going to be relevant for me, even though I'm not part of her target demographic. And I immediately thought about you all, my dear Truth for Teachers listeners, and how many of you might need this message. I bought a copy and absolutely devoured it the next day at a local cafe, taking copious notes on the things that I wanted her to address with you. Neelu's approach is really holistic. It's extremely unique and different from what I usually read in career advice type of books. She's blending academic expertise because she has a business degree and a master's in social and organizational psychology, with her experience as a coach and master practitioner, certified in NeuroLinguistic Programming, yoga, and Ayurveda. It really creates a unique framework. And interestingly, as I formed the questions for the interview, I realized that her perspective is needed here not only for us as educators to learn how to self-advocate, but also to share how we can support students in this way. Neelu talks about how she came from a home culture that deprioritized individual identities and focused on the collective. And as you'll hear throughout this conversation, I had a number of aha moments when new things clicked for me about the way that students from these cultures perform in school and how we can support them more deeply. Listen in. So Neelu, your book and your work really emphasize the importance of self-advocacy. How do you define self-advocacy? Why is it important?
I define self-advocacy as speaking up, speaking out, sharing your ideas. And I have worked in this space through the lens of work, but I believe it absolutely the same skills, the same principles are applicable at home personally as well.
You wrote a lot in your book about what it was like growing up in your home culture. You wrote that self-identity was not cultivated or encouraged. The emphasis was on harmony, sharing of resources, and readiness to give up personal interest for the collective interest. We are expected to embrace and reside in the we and dim the light on the I. And I thought that was really powerful phrasing. I would love to hear more about what that was like growing up and being raised within a collectivist culture with these kinds of values.
Yeah, so my family's from India. I'm Indian. I was born in India, raised in the US. And India is just one example of a collective culture, but there's Asian cultures, Latin cultures, African cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, many cultures that are very collective, which is that very comfortable in the we. Everything is about group and sort of, confrontation is shied away from because it brings shame to a group. So you're really thinking of yourself as part of a unit versus in North America, we think about ourselves and our nuclear family. And we don't really, we do have extended family, but it's not part of like our everyday, not part of like our decision-making processes. Whereas in a lot of collective cultures, there's just a lot more people involved in your day-to-day. Even if they don't live in the home, there's a much more collective, we-based mindset in collective cultures.
One of the things that you mentioned in the book was like you you weren't even taught to say, like, these are my toys, you and your brother. It was our toys,
Yes.
right?
Yes. I remember I said that to my dad once. I said, this is my toy. And he said, no, these are our toys. Everything was about sharing, group harmony. And to the point where, for example, there was one time when I was visiting my family, we were all at dinner. And I said, I looked at the menu and I said, I would like this. And my dad just kind of gave me a look. He was like, well, it's for the whole table. And
Mm.
so I find myself, I love to share, but in that moment, I don't know what happened. Like I wanted something different. And so it was like, no, we have to order for the whole table. And it just reminds me it's all about sharing, and sort of this harmony is more important than your individual opinion and your desires. It's like, no, we're all here together for this shared experience. And so it's like you need to contribute to that shared experience. And that doesn't include you sort of thinking just about yourself.
That's such a great illustration of this concept, because it trickles down to even the smallest ways of being that we don't really think about. For a typical American child to go to a restaurant and choose what they want to order, of course they would choose, unless you're going to what we would call a family style restaurant, right?
Right.
And then you have to come to a consensus. But in general, that's not how we do things. And I imagine that must have been a huge culture shift for you when coming to school. So in your book, you wrote, outside the home, the emphasis in school was on self-sufficiency, was on independence and placement of self-interest over the collective interest. And I would love to hear about what your experience was like as a student, because I think that can give us a really helpful lens into how school is experienced by our students from AAPI households, and then the other cultures you mentioned that emphasize collectivism.
Yeah. So, I remember one of my teachers, she asked me one day after school, so Neelu, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was like, what do you mean? I have a choice? Like it never even
Mm.
occurred to me that I had a choice, because in especially as immigrants, it's all about survival, and it's about what can you do to make money quicker, because it's all about survival, right? So at least I know it has shifted, like based on how many generations you're in, let's say North America, perhaps you don't focus so much. I know for AAPI culture, it was all about medicine, law, business, accounting, right? Like all of the things that would generate income quickly is what your family would encourage. I know being in med school is not a quick return on your investment, but then they're sort of thinking of your long-term return on your investment of your education, because everything is sort of quantified from a financial perspective when you're an immigrant and you're in hustle mode. And so when my parents came to the US, they worked 3 and 4 jobs each. So it was really about, we want to set our kids up for success so that they don't have this financial struggle that we have. And so when my teachers would ask me, what would you like to be? I didn't even realize I had a choice. I just thought I was going to fall into the same categories of what others around me were doing. And it was very much around, you can be a lawyer, you can be a doctor, you can be an accountant, you can be in business, right? Like there was these engineering, things like that, but I'm not good at math or science. So that kind of took that out for me. But the idea really was that there's like these set professions. And so when teachers would ask what I loved to do, and I loved writing, and I remember I got published in this like little newsletter for school, and I was so excited. I came running home and I told my mom that I got published in this newsletter, and I was showing her, and she's like, "What? You want to be a writer?" Like it was just so taboo. It's something she couldn't even comprehend. Right. And there's no right or wrong. And I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just from the worldview that you come from when you're an immigrant, and you're sort of like thinking about how do you set your children up for success? You want to make sure they're in careers where they're going to earn money quickly.
That's such a good way to distinguish things, that we're not talking about right or wrong here.
Yeah.
Because there's pros and cons with both cultures, as both types of cultures, as we'll get into more. What we want to think about is how to balance it, because we're not going to necessarily change either one of these cultures, nor do we need to. The goal is to figure out how to thrive within both of them. And you talked about the tension between this, how you've learned to navigate this, the expectations at home and the expectations in school, and later on in higher ed, and eventually the workplace. And there's a phrase that you wrote that I just thought was so profound. You wrote that you found yourself, quote, uncomfortable with confrontation, plus unable to speak up for yourself, plus constantly worried about the perspective of others, which equaled a huge fail in corporate America. And I think that is highly relatable for a lot of folks listening, including myself. So tell us about that.
I mean, I have gotten downsized so many times, and I don't think it was because I didn't have the most brilliant ideas or that I wasn't intelligent. It was literally because I didn't know how to speak up, to share my ideas. Someone would take credit for my ideas, and I didn't know how to jump back into the conversation. And I think when you come from a collective culture where you're taught just to stay under the radar, that, I mean, my parents would actually say things like, this isn't our country, so you really want to like stay under the radar, just do what you do the things you need to do to succeed. And so when that's the behavior modeled to you, and then that's sort of like your way of being, when you get to corporate America, it's like, if you're sort of just doing good work and keeping your head down and you're not advocating for yourself, no, people will actually assume you're disengaged, even though you're doing great work. It's like you're not getting recognition for that work. And I learned that the hard way. And then when my last downsizing, which was in 2013, I then started my own practice and whatnot. And since then, I've coached and trained thousands of professionals, and I realized there is a common red thread. So even if you don't come from these collective cultures, you could be extremely introverted, or you could be neurodivergent. You could be a subject matter expert. I work a lot with people in tech, and they just want to be coders, and they just want to sit down and code, and that's what they want to do. But in corporate America, that's not enough. Like, it's not enough just to be really good at your job. You also have another job, which is advocating for yourself. Because if people don't know what you're doing, nobody finds out, and they actually perceive that as you not being engaged or not really wanting to be there.
Yeah, I think that's true in teaching as well. There's a lot of folks who they just want to be good teachers. They don't want to have to present as a certain way or make sure that people know what they're doing. But like you said, folks can take credit for your accomplishments for one thing. For another thing, if you ever want to move into a leadership role, you've got to be really comfortable in drawing attention to yourself, which could be really uncomfortable for a lot of people.
I actually work with a lot of people that say they don't want a leadership role. They just want to be subject matter experts. But even then, you still need to advocate for yourself if you want to get a raise, if you want to get a promotion. In most organizations, they don't allow you just to stand still and just be in one position forever, right? Like there's this expectation that you're going to progress in some way, whether you're in a leadership role or you're just climbing the ranks as a subject matter expert. But I do think like self-advocacy is another full-time job, in at least in my space in corporate America. And I would love to
Mhm.
hear from you from an education perspective for teachers.
I think it should be because teaching is a female dominated field. A lot of the norms within the profession are for a woman who plays by the rules. And so a lot of teachers are rule followers.
Right.
And certainly we're talking about, white women in particular, because the majority of the profession is white women. So there's not a lot of diversity in there. So the norms that we're raised with very much influence the culture of schools, which sort of parallels what you were saying about not advocating for yourself. Don't draw attention to yourself. Put other people's needs before yours, especially in a helping profession. You're supposed to be there for the kids. It's not about you. You should be willing to sacrifice everything for students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so fascinating because it's, again, even if you don't come from these collective cultures or you're not raised by parents from collective cultures, women, there are so many messages that we've received through behavior being modeled to us by other women around us when we were growing up. Or you could be from a small town in the US where it's like, stay humble, do just, under the radar. And you could just be a woman and raised in a little bit of more of a patriarchal type of family unit. So these are skills that are not known and easy for us to do.
Mhm. And so what happens is the people who are really confident in this, which tend to be men, which tend to be men from a dominant culture, which tend to be men with a certain type of personality, they get the attention, they move into leadership, and then they shape the further culture, which kind of cuts the rest of us out.
Right, right.
Your book also talks about your experience in teaching and coaching Asian and South Asian women and how you noticed that there was an external motivation source pattern, particularly among those who were raised by immigrant or first generation parents from Asia. So, the idea is that you're sort of making your decisions in order to please other people in terms of what you're doing in your career, like you said earlier. And you compare it to dominant American culture, in which there are fewer people who are giving you advice, and people are taught at a young age to rely on themselves. Self sufficiency is a really big core value in the dominant American culture. So we learn to trust ourselves and our opinions when you're in that kind of culture. But if you're not raised that way, then you don't really learn how to do it. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the external versus internal motivation sources and how you learn to trust yourself.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, a lot of collective cultures, it's shifted, but you think of a unit, and that includes your extended family, even if they don't live in the home. Traditionally, there's like a joint family and there's a lot of people in your home. But even if you've moved away from that, because it progressed in that way, like that's still there in smaller villages, but I think we're moving further and further away from that. Even if you don't live with your extended family has a huge impact on your family. Like they're part of your family. And so it felt like there was always a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And in North America, it's just you and your nuclear family. And so you make decisions based on that unit, that smaller unit. So when you think about it, that perspective, like when you're externally motivated, it's like, for example, when I go to a fitting room and I'm trying on something, I often don't look in the mirror and I can't trust my own judgment. I will ask someone outside and be like, how does this look?
Oh.
or like I will, if a friend is with me, I'll send her a picture, even if she's not with me. Like one of my best friends, she's always getting pictures because I'm just like, I sometimes just feel like I can't trust myself and my own judgment. And I think that comes from having so many inputs into that system that you grew up in. Even though it was just me and my nuclear family with my parents, we just had a lot more inputs. It was just more cultural. It was a group effort. And so when you grow up where you have multiple inputs, you start to question like, okay, now I need data. Now I need stats. That's how it translates as we become adults. Like we can't just take something and say, okay, I'm going to trust my instinct. People who are internally motivated, they just kind of have this internal sense of like a compass that they know this is right or this is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
When you're externally motivated, it's not right or wrong. It's just that you need more sources of information. You need more data, more stats, more input from people, more feedback from your feedback forms, right? And again, nothing's right or wrong. It's just how we've grown up. And I think for me, the shift really has become I think when you have a few more years under your belt, you start to think, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm doing a good job. I have this internal feeling that this was a great speech that I just gave or a great class I just taught or something like that. But I think in the beginning of my career, I definitely felt like I didn't have that internal compass and I was constantly needing like reinforcement from sources, like from my manager or from my team. And it wasn't happening. So then I immediately assumed like, oh no, I did something wrong. When in actuality, I didn't do anything wrong. I just needed to trust my gut a little bit more. And I noticed that a lot of people from Asian cultures have the same sense of needing a lot of inputs, whether it's research, whether it's data, whether it's stats, versus just having this feeling of like, no, I kind of know. And then you pick and choose, right? Like when we are in fields where we need to bring in research and data and stats and case studies, that's all good. But sometimes it's excess, right? Like analysis paralysis. It's like knowing when to not have to get so many more points of validation. I think that's the challenge with people who are externally motivated. It's like knowing when to stop that sort of digging deep for more information.
Right. And then those of us who have more of an internal source of motivation need to learn how to gather more information and not just always think that we're right all the time.
Right. So it's a balance, right? Like, again, neither is right or wrong. I think when you go to the extremes is when it's like, okay, there's got to be a point in the middle where it's like, and it's contextual. You could be internally motivated in your personal life, but at work, you could be externally motivated. So knowing what context you're internally or externally motivated really helps sort of decide like, okay, it's at work. I'm very externally motivated. How many sources of information do I really need? And like really be aware and conscious of it kind of helps those of us that come from that experience of needing multiple inputs.
That's important to think about because I feel like in school, we really emphasize the internal motivation. Like we don't want kids to need rewards to do their work. And we want them to be inherently motivated, to be self-driven. And I'm realizing now, like what a cultural bias that is, that some people are not going to naturally be like that. But yet we value that above all else. The people who are, looking for confirmation or affirmation or wanting to gather more information before making a decision, that's seen as it is seen as not as ideal as being totally internally driven and being really confident in everything that you're thinking and just moving forward without needing direction. That self-sufficiency and independent piece. And it doesn't always serve us. And more importantly, it doesn't always fit who our students are and the home cultures that they're representing in our classrooms that we need to be more mindful of.
Right. And that brings such a good point. Like the teacher could perceive that as, oh, this child is not intrinsically motivated.
Yes.
No, the child is very motivated. He or she is looking for all this extra information. So it's not that it ties to their intrinsic or is it extrinsic motivation? Or that it's about the sources of information they need to feel secure with the decision they're making. If that makes sense. Yeah.
It does. Oh, that's good. That's a big light bulb moment for me.
Yeah.
I really like that. That's good. Let's talk more about these kinds of strategies to think about how to juxtapose these two worlds. A question that you've posed in your book is, when you come from a we-based culture, how do you become comfortable and thrive in an I culture? And one approach that you recommend is a concept called a part of and apart from. How does that work?
Okay, so let's say you're part of a group and it's a group effort. So you're on a team and there's something you're working on together. So you're a part of that team, but you also want to be apart from that team because that's what's going to help you in your career. That's what's going to help you when you have that performance review conversation. That's what's going to help you get a promotion. That's what's going to help you get a raise. So you're still there with the group. It's not like you're taking credit for other people's work. You're just drawing attention to the things that you've done so that you get credit for the things that you input into that group effort, if it makes sense.
Hmm. What does that look like? Let's say if we have a collaborative effort on something or a team working together, what might that look like to practice being a part of and apart from?
So let's say you're in a meeting and you're all working towards a milestone deliverable, everything's going on schedule, and something gets derailed. And so you might want to, for you to be apart from the team, you might have done some research on what we can do to get back on schedule. And so you bring that up, right? Like, so your voice is kind of always heard. And also you bring attention, not in an obnoxious way, but I I saw this coming, so I did some research on ways we can get back on target or back on schedule.
Mm.
So you're still bringing the limelight on you for a moment or two, even though that might feel uncomfortable in a group effort. But you always want to remember that you can be part of the collective and you still have this individual piece and this individual contribution. And I think that's what's required in corporate America from my experience.
That sounds like a good practice in general, and definitely something that we can be teaching for our students too, because we run up against the same thing in group projects in class, right? Where there's one kid who takes over and does all the work for everybody else, or kind of bullies everybody else into submission, and then other kids who actually have a lot to contribute, but they're not speaking up. They're not actually saying anything because there's other kids with different personalities that are sort of overshadowing them.
Right, and then that kid walks away thinking, "Oh, you know what? My opinion's not valuable." Uh, and it's this downward spiral that happens, and it happens in work too, right? Like
Yeah.
you just feel like there's no space for you to interject, so you're like, "Okay, my opinion doesn't matter. I'm not gonna voice my opinion. It doesn't really matter." And then it's a repetitive pattern that happens.
Yes. Yes. And so we can interrupt that by thinking about this, a part of and apart from.
Yeah.
Hmm. I like that. Another strategy you suggest in the book is to move from problem framed questions to outcome framed questions. And that's a really important mindset piece. Mindset stuff is my jam. I would love to have you share more about that.
Yeah, so problem frame questions are judgy and
Mm.
accusatory almost. So you might say, "Whose fault is it?" or "Who ca- who did this?" or "Why is this happening to me?" Right? Like these kind of questions that are very judgy versus outcome framed, which is, "Who can I ask for help? How
Mm.
can I learn what I need to do to get back on track? What else do I need to know about the situation?" They're much more solution focused, and you can probably even viscerally feel the difference between the two sets, right? Like the problem frame, it's like you might even feel a tightness in your body, feel constricted. Whereas when you're in an outcome frame, you're curious and you're looking
Mm.
for opportunities where you can learn to do things different versus a problem, you're in a judger mindset. And I think that's really, it's not easy to do to flip the switch in the moment, but the awareness of being able to do that is really helpful. And then I have strategies that I go through. And like when you're on that path, it's like, how do you break that or interrupt that pattern so that you can move into sort of this learner outcome frame question mindset?
And that's essential to self advocacy, because how can you advocate for yourself when you're being judgmental of yourself or of others, really?
Right, and it starts with us. We are
Mm.
our worst critics. So we're gonna be the first one to say, "Oh, I should have done this," or "Why didn't I speak up in the last meeting? Why didn't I not get that promotion?" Right? So we're always kind of like looking at the things that we did versus thinking
Mhm.
about, "Okay, who can I ask for support so that I can make sure I interrupt the meeting next time?" Or, "How do I do this? Who can I learn from?" It's just more open, it's more curious. I think the underlying theme of outcome framed is just that you have a curiosity to do things differently and you're not blaming yourself and you're not blaming others.
So we've talked about apart from, a part of, and apart from. We've talked about moving from problem framed questions to outcome framed questions. Another strategy you recommend is practicing non attachment. How does that factor into self advocacy juxtaposing these two different worlds and different cultures and being your own cheerleader.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you've read, or I'm sure you've heard about Mel Robbins' new book, Let Them.
Yes.
Well, it's like I'm listening to the audiobook over and over, but it's the similar concept where it's like you put your effort forward, you can only control you. So once you do the work, once you work as a group and you submit whatever you need to submit, or you're working on an application, or you're writing of something, right? Like once you do it, the control is over, because now it's out in the world and you have to just wait and see what happens. So I think the non-attachment piece comes from Buddhism as well. It's where it's like you put your best foot forward, and then you cannot control the uncontrollables, which are other people. So, and I love the way Mel Robbins framed it, is like, let them do what they do, but you have the power and the onus is on you to do what you can do. So I think when it comes to advocating for yourself, it's like, yes, do that in the meeting, do that in the moment, flex the self-advocacy muscle. And then you can't really be attached to the results, because you don't know what the results are going to be, because there's so many other people involved and you can't control other people. You can only control yourself.
Right. Right. You also mentioned, as related to this, about how our goals don't have to end with a period or an exclamation point, but with a comma. And so the goal is to practice non attachment to whatever comes after the comma. How does that work?
Yeah. So for me, a punctuation mark, like whether it's a period or an exclamation, it feels like there's a finality to it. And I think one of my spiritual teachers many years ago said that, we're humans and we are constantly evolving. And so the comma to me represents this fluidity that we have with ourselves, where we're not just tied to some like goal that we set. And this happens in the new year, right? Like people say, oh, I want to lose 100 pounds, which may not be healthy, first of all.
Mhm.
But secondly, a month later, you may realize, like, I don't want to do that. And so that's where the
Mhm.
comma to me represents fluidity and sort of self-compassion, where it's like you can adjust in the moment. You don't have to be so fixated or tied to this outcome that you once desired a month ago or a year ago or 5 years ago, because we're human and things are constantly changing and there's things that we can't control.
Mhm. I think of the comma as a pause too. It's that place where you take a breath, and so often we move from one goal to the next. In education, a lot of times the goalposts are being moved on you.
Yeah.
You achieve 80% student proficiency in this thing, and like, okay, great, now 85%. It's like, wait a second. I didn't even get to take a chance to recognize all of my hard work, all of my students' hard work, everything that we've accomplished. We need that pause, that comma, before we move immediately on to the next thing and try to predict exactly what that next thing is going to be, because we don't know.
Yeah. And we do that. Like we don't take a beat. And I think the
Mm,
beat is so important, because even with our mindset, right? Usually we're ruminating about the past or catastrophizing about the future. And the
yeah.
comma is really a beat, which allows you to ground into the present moment, where it's like, okay, I just completed that 80%, and I need to give myself a pat on the back. So I have the personal agency to then do the other 5% or strive for that 100%. But again, yeah, I think you're spot on with that pause and that beat and just grounding into the present moment.
Yeah. I want to spend the rest of our time together addressing the issues of being conflict avoidant and confrontation avoidant, which we talked about just a little bit in the beginning. Educators frequently need to advocate for things like manageable workloads and better resources. They're expected to just sort of figure it out on their own and, buy things out of pocket and all that sort of stuff. And I'm wondering how self advocacy could help here. How can teachers effectively voice concerns to their administrators, especially when they feel uncomfortable with confrontation and it feels like something a bad thing, like you're being a problem, when you're actually coming and asking for supportive resources to do your job well?
One of the things about human beings is that the way we are in one situation is how we are in all situations. So if it feels viscerally uncomfortable to advocate for yourself, to ask for things, to avoid conflict, to avoid confrontation, you're not just going to magically wake up one day and do it at work and feel comfortable doing it. So I think it's really important to start practicing where it's not as risky. So that could be
Mm,
at home. For me, I remember there were oftentimes, and still oftentimes, when my husband might say, let's go for Thai food, and I actually want pizza or Indian food. And for me, even to voice, like, no, 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 I actually want Indian food. That's actually an act of self advocacy, because again, the behavior that was modeled to me was just don't rock the boat. Let's just go with the flow, whatever the group wants. Right. And so when you're raised with that mindset, whether you're from a collective culture or you're a woman or you're neurodivergent or you're introverted, it's like these are muscles that we haven't flexed. So we want to flex in many other context so that we can do that at work. And I think that's one thing we think like, oh, at work, I can just automatically wake up one morning and do this great act of self-advocacy without taking the reps. Like just it's like you wouldn't go run
Mm.
a marathon without practicing. You're not going to be able just to go up to your boss and say, hey, I need all of these school supplies. And actually, you know what? I don't want to pay for it myself. I think the school should pay for it. Like that's a huge act for someone who is confrontation avoidant because the boss might say, no, we don't have the budget for it. And then it's a dialogue, right? But like, you're not going to wake up one day and just be able to magically do that if you don't practice in other contexts, which might be safer contexts to practice.
Hmm. And when you gave that example about being honest with your husband about the kind of food you wanted, I think of myself as like a highly opinionated person, and I don't have a problem saying what I want. But what I do in those kinds of situations is I will take on the emotional labor of being the easy person. So especially if there's more than one person, I'll be like, whatever you guys want, it's fine.
Right.
And sometimes I'm thinking, Angela, why don't you just tell them what you want? Why don't you just make a suggestion of a restaurant that you like and see if they like it? Because the truth is, no one ever wants to decide what's for dinner. Like, it's so tedious trying to figure out what you're going to eat.
Right.
And if someone says there's a great restaurant, it's got something for everybody, it's got this and this, how about we do that? And you take charge in that way. That's not you being problematic or confrontational. That's actually you coming with a solution. And often it will be my tendency to just be like, oh, I'll just go along with whatever.
Exactly. And it could be annoying actually to the people around you as well.
Yeah.
I've actually had friends say, you're doing that again. Like, what? People pleasing. Like, I'm just like, no, 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 we'll just go with the
Mm,
flow. It's just one meal. I'll have whatever. And at
yes.
the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. It is only one meal. But I think, again, it's that muscle. And the more you practice it, whether your suggestion is taken or not, that's not the point. The point is that you're practicing in other contexts so that you can go to your manager or your boss on Monday morning and ask for school supplies and ask for the school to pay for those school supplies so you're not covering it out of your own pocket.
Right. How could we expect ourselves to do that when we won't even say what we want for dinner or what TV show we want to watch?
Exactly, exactly,
What
exactly.
about the fear of being labeled as difficult or too assertive? I know that can hold people back, especially women of color. How can individuals frame these fears to feel more confident when you're worried that people are going to think you're difficult?
I actually want to flip that completely on its tail and say, when you are advocating for yourself and when you are your own cheerleader, that's the most unselfish act you can do because you're literally leaving a trail for all of the people behind you that look like you. For a teacher,
Mm,
think about all of those little kids that are looking at you and they're going to remember you. Hopefully they're going to remember you. I have teachers from grade school that I still remember. And it's like you are carving a path for all of the little kids behind you that look like you or they identify with some part of you, and you're leaving a trail. So you're modeling a behavior that they can then take, not just in school, they can take at home. They can then take into their lives as grown adults. And so I think being your own cheerleader is actually one of the most collective acts that one can do.
I have like whole body chills right now from this idea of leaving. How did you phrase it? The trail that you're leaving behind you for others to follow?
Yeah, and if you are a woman of color, a
Oh,
teacher of color, like all of those kids in your classroom, they're looking at you. You even let's say there's like very diverse classroom and you're a teacher of color, you might not be the same ethnicity or race, but you're carving a path for all of those kids that aren't in the dominant culture.
mm, mhm.
And so when you advocate for yourself, when you get the resources that you need to be the best teacher you can be, you're showing those kids how to do that for themselves.
Mhm. And that's a skill that all students need, regardless of gender or race, ethnicity. And I'm actually thinking also about the modeling for colleagues because so many of the norms in school culture about just keeping your head down, don't draw attention to yourself, really come from the fact that when people do that, they can get blackballed. They are seen as difficult. They are seen as stirring the pot or making things difficult, complainers, that sort of thing. And when someone can step up and advocate in a way that is actually constructive, it provides the model for other people to do the same and shifts those norms one teacher at a time. If you have another teacher on your team who's doing those kinds of things, that's a model for you now to follow. And thinking about it that way, it is so deeply unselfish. It is actually shifting the entire culture of the school just one action at a time, which is incredible power.
Right. Yeah. So for those of us that are uncomfortable, being in the I space, if you think about it, it's actually yes, you're advocating for your raise or your promotion or to get your school supplies covered, but you're actually doing it for the collective good because there's other teachers that are going to be watching. There's other students that are watching. You're a role model. You
Mm-hmm.
want to advocate for yourself so others can follow in your footsteps.
So, how do you do that? Like, what would you say if you're going to your boss and you're saying, um, I don't have sufficient planning time to prepare for these lessons because my planning time keeps getting taken away. A lot of times that happens. Like, you end up having to cover for someone else or a teacher's absent or something. So you don't have the sufficient time that you need in order to do your job well. You want to bring that up. How could you do that in a way that is advocating for yourself and constructive, but not being confrontational or difficult or being that dreaded complainer that everyone seems to hate?
I think when we go to people who are in leadership roles and we're saying that we need extra things, whether it's money, whether it's resources, whatever, we want to come in with a solution mindset. So,
Yes.
yes. So yes, there are reasons why what was the example you just gave?
About needing more time for
Yeah.
preparing lessons. Mhm.
There are a few reasons why I need more time. I'm happy to share if you want those details, but here's my proposal. Like, this is what I can do to get back on track or whatever. Right? Because maybe that leader doesn't want all those details. And maybe if you give all of those details, it's like you're making excuses for yourself. But you can
Mm.
say there are 3 reasons why. I'm happy to share if you're interested. And also, here's a proposal.
That's really good. It mirrors a lot the advice that I give to teachers, which is the same thing. Come with solutions.
Right.
Don't expect your leader to come up with a solution for you because A, that's asking them to do more work. B, you might not like the solution they come up with.
Exactly.
They don't know all of your needs. So really what you should think about is, okay, what's a specific situation here that would help? Maybe instead of attending the staff meeting, I can have that time to work in my classroom. Can I ask for permission for that? And say, I really need to finish up these lesson plans or this data that's due. Could I do that instead of going to the meeting? Otherwise, I'm going to have to stay after the meeting and continue to work on it then. Could I do that instead? So coming up with something very specific or even
Right.
having some alternatives is so much easier because then the leader can just be like, yeah, that's fine, or shift things a little bit versus having to rack their brain and think, okay, when am I going to have this person do this? How can I support them? What are the resources available? And then they suggest something and you don't like it anyway, and they didn't make you happy. So now, like, what's the incentive for them to keep trying?
Absolutely. You're right. And, they may have tunnel vision because they're looking at something in a very linear way. And
Yeah.
the solutions that would work best for you. It's better to just take that mental labor away from them and say,
Yeah.
here are some options.
Yeah. And I also really like your approach of like, I have these are the reasons why. I'll tell you if you want to know them, if you're interested,
Right.
but let me get right to the solution because I can also imagine situations where, a leader is sitting at their desk, they're responding to emails, there's all these things going on, and you walk in and you're like, I don't have this done because blank and blank and blank and blank. And it feels like you're just sort of emotionally dumping on them. And they're like, what did you even want? Like,
Yeah.
I can imagine how that must feel because that's how teachers feel when students are like, I didn't get the assignment done because this happened and this happened and this happened. It's like, cut to the part where you tell me when you're going to do the work and turn it in. If you cut right to, my work isn't done. I have reasons for that. I can explain if you want to hear. However, my plan is to get it done this afternoon if you'll give me an extension. Fine.
Exactly. And time is our most finite resource.
Yeah.
I know kids don't think of this because the kids, they think they have endless time. But from a leader perspective, and as teachers, when you're going to your leaders and asking for things, the quicker you can make it and be really efficient with what you're asking for, and you're also taking into consideration what you need and advocating for yourself and your ideas, it's a win-win for both. It's a
Mhm.
win-win for you and it's a win-win for your leader.
What would this look like in a situation where you are with peers? So, like if you're in your grade level team or department level team, you're discussing a process for something and you disagree with one of your colleagues. So, this isn't someone who you report to, it's not a boss, someone who's on the same level as you, but you disagree, you don't think that their approach is the right way, but you're really nervous to speak up because you need to work with this person. Do you have any tips for those kinds of situations?
I don't know if you've ever done improv, but if you have, it's one of the
Ah,
very good, easy, and you've probably heard this is yes and.
yes,
So
and
yes, so yes, I hear you, and here's another alternative that we could consider. And
love
it
it.
doesn't really, it's not combative. It's like, yes, I agree with parts of what you're saying, and here's another suggestion.
Mhm.
I think when we say but, immediately our brains go to, oh no, she's going to disagree with me, or there's some sort of confrontation. So I think yes and is a great strategy to use across any industry when you're trying to get others on board, when you're trying to influence them to go in the direction that you think is better. And maybe after you hear everyone's opinions, maybe you change your mind and say, oh, you know what? That works better.
Mm. And I think a key phrase there that you said was, the goal is to change people's minds or bring them on board. You may change your own mind, but if your goal is to be persuasive, then you got to be persuasive. And so that's when you go in there with that goal, it's just like going to the leader with solutions. I'm not here to complain, I'm here with a solution.
Right.
And in this team meeting, I'm not here just to go against you and make you feel wrong or bad or to tear down your idea. I'm actually really convinced that this other approach is going to be better. Let me be as persuasive as I can, and laying that out so other people get on board, other people have the buy-in. It's not just me forcing my way in there, it's actually convincing them that this is going to be a more effective approach.
Yeah, I think yes and is a great strategy. And I also just think from a mindset perspective, it's like you want to be a masterful communicator. And
Mm,
in order to be a masterful communicator, you don't expect people to meet you at your bus stop. You meet
mm,
them at their, like you meet at each other's butts, like a
mhm.
mutually convenient bus stop. And I think if we go one step further, if you're trying to influence, you meet others at their bus stop.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. What role does mindfulness and emotional regulation play in preparing for these uncomfortable conversations or potentially uncomfortable situations?
Well, if it's so uncomfortable for you, you realize this, you're aware of this. So maybe before you're going to walk into that meeting or before you're going to have that conversation, you're going to take some deep breaths, ground into the present moment. Because again, you might be the reason that you're having this anxiety or this emotional dysregulation is because you are ruminating about the past. You might think, oh, this happened previously with this person, so it's going to happen again with this person. Or you're catastrophizing, like, well, what if he or she says this? Then what am I going to do? So I think if we just take moments to ground into the present moment, and the easiest way to do that is through our breath. And if that's not your
Mm.
thing, then using one of your five senses, like maybe just grounding your feet before you step into the room with the person, just like ground into the present moment, whatever that looks like for you.
One of the things that I love most about your book and that surprised me about it, that really made it stand out as unique, is it is very much this East meets West kind of vibe to it, where you're talking about like business corporate strategies and you're quoting all of these neuroscience researchers. Then you're talking about all these Ayurvedic principles and yoga and breath work and Buddhism and all of these things that kind of get us out of our heads and more into our bodies and into our experience. And I feel like that's the balance that so many resources are missing and that so many of us as humans are missing. And that for me, when I found yoga, that really was transformative for me, because I've heard people say things like, focus on the breath, take deep breaths. I'm like, this is not doing anything for me. Like,
Right.
it's a whole practice. Like you're saying, it's a way of being
Mhm.
and an embodiment of these principles. And you keep showing up and doing it in different situations. And then it just becomes a natural part of who you are. So when you're in the more challenging situations, you've already flexed that muscle, as you said.
Right, because we can be on our mats and we can practice these things, and then again, it's flexing in others' contexts. So take the things you learned about grounding into your feet and taking deep breaths, and you're moving it into a conversation with your manager or your leader of the organization that's uncomfortable, and you're still practicing the same skills. It's just you're
Mhm.
doing it in a different context.
Your book has a lot of practical examples. I think pretty much every chapter has like a practice, right? Something that you can do to kind of embody these principles. Is there something that you use a lot that is useful for you, a specific grounding practice or regulation or mindfulness practice?
I think for me, movement. And so when I get
Mm.
dysregulated, I think moving in any way, shape, or form, because
Yep.
motion changes your emotional state. So walking, yoga, just getting up. So if like you're on a Zoom call and something didn't go right, it's like, I'll be right back. And you just get up and you move and you come back and you're in a different state. And I think for me, movement has always been something that helps me get back into a regulated state.
For me, I think it's nature, and the movement ties into it because a lot of times I'm going for a walk in nature or
Exactly.
stepping outside. If I'm in a natural setting, I see trees that have been there long before
Yeah.
we were here. They're gonna be here long after me. I see the animals, the squirrels, hiding their acorns, all the things that they're going to continue to do regardless of what's happening in my world, and it really puts things in perspective. And if I'm in a city setting, I look around, I'm like, look at all of these other people with all of their problems and all of their things that they're going through and the things they're trying to get done in their day. And it just gives me that sense of perspective. Even just stepping outside, a quick walk around the block really makes a big difference in my mental state.
Same for me. I mean, I'm a tree hugger, so I will go to
Yep.
the park just to hug trees because I just feel like, again, those trees have been here for way before us. They will be here way after us. There's just this sense of calm that I feel with nature as well. So I agree. Like if you have the ability to get up and walk around and be in nature, or maybe you do that after your work day, but making sure that's part of your repertoire just to calm the nerves.
Yeah. Even gazing out the window, window gaze meditations that's a whole practice. There's whole traditions around that. But, I would find as a teacher, like I taught a lot in Florida. And so there were palm trees outside of my window, which, what's more calming than a palm tree? And at those moments where I'm like, I cannot do this. These kids are driving me nuts. I could just look out the window at that palm tree.
Mhm.
It's been just blowing in the breeze. It's bending to the wind. It's not trying to stand up straight and rigid and hold its position. It's shifting according to whatever the circumstances are, even up to hurricane force winds.
Mhm.
Palm trees can bend all the way down to the ground, be resilient, and just reminding myself that there's something bigger than me. And it's not just me. I'm part of something so much bigger. These kids are part of something
Mhm.
much bigger with me. It's not just about me getting my plan done and my agenda accomplished. There's something so much bigger. So even just looking out the window for a few seconds can really shift my mindset. Maybe that's just me, but
No,
it's been helpful.
it's so funny because I do that throughout the day too. Like between
Yeah.
Zooms, I'll just look outside and I don't have the greatest view, but I will find something that I can just sort of focus my gaze on and
Yeah.
it just allows me to just calm down.
I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Finding those little things that work for you it's a lifelong practice, but it's fun. It's an experiment. It's a journey. And it's fun to talk about that kind of thing. I want to close out with a takeaway truth. What's something that you wish every teacher understood about self-advocacy and the things that we talked about?
I mean, I think this was what was the most like eye-opening experience for me talking to you is that how self-advocacy could be so beneficial for teachers and for students. I wish the teachers that I came into contact with, what I wish they knew is that not all of us are raised the same way. And so when you think
Mm,
about some of these intercultural dimensions that make it more difficult for children to speak up, if it's a collective versus an individual household, also if we think of power distance, that's another dimension that we didn't
mm,
really cover, but in many collective cultures and in Asian cultures, the power distance is greater. So what that means is that there's a deference for authority. And so you
mm,
would be not as comfortable going to someone who isn't an authoritative figure and asking questions or pushing back in any way. Whereas in individualistic cultures, typically there's less of a power distance. You could just walk into your boss's office and say, hey, I have to talk to you about a couple of things, usually. And so when you're a child and there's that much distance in a power distance between you and someone in an authoritative capacity, there's a level of fear. So you may not even feel comfortable going to your teacher and having an open conversation. And so when teachers are aware of that, they might be more compassionate. They might engage with that student a little differently, knowing that, hey, I have to meet that child at their bus stop and make sure that they don't think that there's a huge power differential between